So CBS News law enforcement analyst Paul Violas is joining us now. Welcome back, Paul. Thanks a lot. We spoke to you earlier on the phone. Can you walk us through what law enforcement will be doing right now at this point in the investigation? We know that there's, the shooting. There are 2 bombs that were explosive devices that were found, and police have descended on at least 1 home. It seems like that they're going through.
Right. Again, good morning, Anne-Marie. Good morning, Vlad. Where we are right now, and I think the best thing for us to do with respect to educating our viewers is picture like marker boarding this entire scenario. There are a variety of silos that are all running simultaneously at this point from a law enforcement perspective. So to start off with, we have 3 suspects in custody. Those 3 suspects are going to be isolated by police. They will not speak to each other. They'll be interviewed separately and again, completely apart. Second are handling the crime scenes. We have 2 that we know of, but clearly there may be more that have not been disclosed. It's imperative for us to understand that right now, what law enforcement has to do is switch gears, being that they have suspect in custody, is now move towards preparing for the prosecutorial side of this investigation. Hence, they need to make sure that they secure those crime scenes, they're not tainted, and that they're able to ascertain from the genesis of this particular incident every piece of particular evidence, crime scene evidence, whatever there may be. So that's crime scene handling. The next now is the beginning of the investigation and on the technical side, which is going to be fascinating because when we think about what's happened here, the use of the internet, and we've seen this before, but was used magnanimously in this particular incident, to the extent that, from what I understand, one of the incidences was live streamed. So they're going to need to begin the investigation from the social media side. They're going to need to go through this individual and anybody that's associated with that individual's communications on the social media side. And then they'll switch gears and they'll move into looking at forensic evidence coming from closed-circuit television cameras and hopefully artificial intelligence, or AI, that's associated with those cameras, to look at the beginning part of this day. Beginning part, I understand it happened at 1:40 p.m. or approximately that local time in New Zealand. They'll go back to those cameras to see what they can ascertain, information they can garner as to who was involved, possibly more people that were involved. Were there vehicles involved, and who were they owned by? So that part of the investigation will go now simultaneously. And then last but not least, as we see in our country, is the legal side. Search warrants, as you alluded to earlier, a couple minutes ago, Anne-Marie, search warrants have been obtained. And then they're going to go after homes, they will go after devices, and they will go after vehicles. And at that point, again, moving to the collection and garnering of evidence and moving to the prosecutorial side, securing that information to learn more about who this individual is, who else may have been involved, what the mantra was behind this, what the mens rea or intent was, and the totality of this entire incident.
Paul, I wonder if you could explain to our audience the challenges and the difficulties, such as they may be, in tracking homegrown terrorism versus the kind that where, I think generally when people are thinking about terrorism and the way that it's been posited by some politicians is that terrorism comes from the outside. But I wonder in this case, and as we've seen time and time again, you have somebody who is generally, and this individual apparently is connected to Australia in some way, but traditionally in terms of cultural and tradition is, for the lack of a better word, from that part of the world. I wonder what the difficulties and challenges are. How does it work? What are the 2 streams that law enforcement look at when they're trying to track homegrown terrorists?
Well, you know what, Vlad, it's an excellent point because it is so much more difficult to track a homegrown terrorist. And the reason for that, as we talk about the different strains, is intelligence gathering. They're not affiliated with a particular group. So it's very difficult when you look at really just the sheer numbers, Vlad, when you look at the sheer population of individuals that can fall into this particular bucket, it makes it extremely difficult for law enforcement to identify them, which is why one of the questions a lot of our viewers have had so far that I understand is, why wasn't this individual or those associated with them on a watch list. It goes back to that point that the question you just asked, Vlad. Because it is so difficult to identify these individuals, it makes it that much more difficult to launch surveillance, to launch an investigation, to gather enough information to warrant them being watched steadily and being put on a particular list. So clearly much more difficult from a law enforcement perspective, especially when you start talking hate crimes, Vlad. And then in concert with that, and the second part of your question, in concert with that, the means of social media. We don't police social media. We don't monitor social media. So it's a median for individuals like this, the lone wolf, the individual not associated with a group, to communicate in an unfettered manner. Makes it very, very difficult on law enforcement to identify these folks.
Okay, I want to dig in a little bit more to what had been found on social media in a moment, Paul. Just stand by because we want to bring in someone else that we want to talk to. Nadia Tolich. She works for a News Talk ZB national radio network. It's based out of the New Zealand city of Auckland. Thank you so much for joining us, because I'm sure you're pretty busy right now. Let's sort of go back to the beginning. We saw portions of that video, but can you walk us through how this shooting unfolded?
Absolutely. Anne-Marie, I can tell you that it has been an extremely long day and one of the most harrowing in my career. This morning we were going about our business and come afternoon time around 2 p.m. we were alerted by a talkback caller to our radio station that there was in fact a shooting in the city of Christchurch. Christchurch is our second biggest city, Auckland being the largest. Approximately 370,000 people live in Christchurch. The shooting was in and around a mosque in the central city, and apparently it was rapid fire. People reported hearing 20 to 30 shots at a time. What we now know is that a gunman walked in there. Apparently there were around 300 people worshipping, and he let fire. He had an automatic weapon and just kept shooting and shooting and shooting. We had an eyewitness tell us that he had gone into a bathroom to wash his hands. The shooting unfolded outside the door. He didn't know what to do. He said that the killer was cold-blooded, worse than a terrorist. He was recounting how awful it was. He was trying to call our emergency service lines, who didn't turn up for about 20 minutes. So an extremely nerve-wracking time. We now know that so many more were injured at a second mosque as well. We still have tonight families waiting at Christchurch Hospital to hear news of their loved ones. We've had reports that periodically people are wailing and crying as they find out the news as to whether their loved one has survived or not.
When you say 20 minutes for emergency services to arrive, I imagine as journalists that's one of the questions you're asking. Have you gotten any information about why it took so long?
It probably took so long because of the severity of the situation. We're talking about an active shooter. It is hard to describe to a country that has weapons freely. New Zealand does not. We do not have high usage of guns. They're not on everybody's hip. That doesn't how it work. That's not how it works here. We certainly have guns. Don't get me wrong, but they're usually used in recreational sports on rural properties and so forth. You have to be registered and police vetted to own a weapon like that. But an automatic weapon of military grade, like what we have seen today, that is very unusual indeed. And so it is probably something that we were just not expecting. So I can imagine that the police took their time because they had to. I have to point out that Christchurch, unfortunately, is not the entire community are not strangers to tragedy. 8 years ago, we've just marked the 8th anniversary of the Christchurch quake in 2011, where 185 people died. The city is still rebuilding. They are such resilient people, but certainly this will break them. It's absolutely tragic.
Nadia, I want to ask you a little bit about some of the other topics we've been covering in relation to this tragedy. The fact that the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has talked about how welcoming New Zealand is to refugees, to immigrants, that in fact she talked about that when she was mounting her political platform, that she wanted to increase the number of immigrants and refugees to New Zealand. We spoke to a resident of New Zealand who is Muslim, and he told us that he could count on one hand the number of times he ever felt that he was being targeted because of his ethnicity and his religion. I just want to get a sense from you of what it's like to be an immigrant and in New Zealand, given that this community is suffering immensely right now. I wonder, what can you tell us about them?
New Zealand is an incredibly diverse country. I cannot express enough how diverse we are. We are a very peaceful nation. Not a lot happens. So that is why something like this is so jarring. We do not see it. It never happens. Yes, we have crime like any other nation. Yes, we have, serious injuries and so forth and assaults, what have you. But we do not see things like this. I think by and large people would find New Zealand to be a very safe place. And in the manifesto of the person who committed these crimes, allegedly, he stated that New Zealand was selected because of this peaceful community that we have. I certainly wouldn't think people would feel unsafe here. We are a welcoming country. We are. We're all immigrants here to New Zealand. So at the end of the day, whether you're fifth generation or first, we all came here by some method.
That's a good point. That's a really good point that you mentioned that, Nadia, because I think a lot of people might forget that, in fact, if you happen to be of European descent, you are an immigrant to New Zealand.
Absolutely, that's absolutely correct. I think here what is just so jarring, as I've said, I've never ever seen anybody with an automatic weapon other than overseas. I was in New York for the presidential election, and for the first time ever I saw military-grade guns with police. We don't see that here. It is quite alarming, it's unnerving, and I think that this will change New Zealand forever, which is incredibly sad. To know that people were killed in a peaceful environment, in a place of worship, is truly diabolical, and I'm so ashamed that that happened here, although I know it's not New Zealand's fault.
Just stand by a little bit, Nadia, because you mentioned the manifesto, so I want to sort of bounce back to Paul, because Paul, I know you took a look at the manifesto. I don't know how much of it you got through, because it's pretty long, but he sort of does this question and answer thing where he anticipates questions that either, a journalist or police may ask, and then he answers them, including what his motive is. Anything that stood out to you when you went through it?
Absolutely, Anne-Marie, absolutely. And just to clarify for our viewers that we're talking about the author of the manifesto, so we have absolutely no idea, and there's no verification, as you pointed out earlier, that there's a connection verified to the shooter in this case. So that being said, there are three things that really permeate throughout it. Now, I haven't read them in the entirety. I will, but I have gone through it. There are three words that really permeate throughout the entire manifesto, and they are invaders, replacement, and conquer. Invaders, he speaks about immigrants coming into his country. Replacement, he speaks about white people, specifically white males, being replaced by immigrants. And then the last part, he speaks about conquering all those that are not like him. And this he says throughout the entire manifesto. The other part that I find fascinating here is that it's clearly instructional. He's not trying just to send a message, Anne-Marie. He's trying to instruct others about his way of life, his line of thought, and he also makes a comment or referral to things in the United States vis-a-vis the horrific events that we've seen of late, that we've covered together in Pittsburgh, Charlottesville, etc. The other part that I find really fascinating, I'm looking at my notes so I don't make a mistake on this, is he talks about a grand movement. But yet, as he refers to the grand movement, he says not yet fully established. And he mentions that in several components, as if there is a global plan in the underground that's going on, which speaks to some of the things that we covered here at CBS and CBSN when we were looking at Pittsburgh and Charlottesville. Last but not least, the thing that's worth noting is he mentions children. He mentions children several times throughout the entire document. And what he says is, and I quote, "Children of invaders do not stay children," which means that this individual and all like him will continue to focus their efforts on all ages, specifically children, as if to weed out and move towards more of a genocide approach. A frightening document, but when you think about it, also speaks, Anne-Marie, to 2 years in the planning. So it goes back to what we mentioned earlier.
Nadia, let me ask you a question. As a reporter, as a journalist in New Zealand, going forward, what kinds of questions will you be asking of your elected officials and your police officials as we try to process this horrific tragedy?
Well, I think plain and simple, it is how did this happen? I mean, obviously this person was active on social media and various channels for some time, in the last few months from what we can see, and he wasn't picked up, and it wasn't picked up. So that is incredibly disturbing. You know, what I would hope from here moving forward is that people don't read the manifest, that they do not watch the video. I think it incites hatred, and I think it is revolting. And I don't think any media outlet should do that either. But I suppose in saying this and in the ensuing weeks, we'll find out exactly what happened and why our safety precautions and safety net in and around our borders failed.
All right, Nadia Tolich, News Talk ZB Content Director, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate your perspective and your reporting. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're sticking with Paul Violas. We did get a statement, Paul, from the White House that was just handed to us. So the United States, I'm just going to read it. This is from Sarah Cook, and I'll share it with our viewers. The United States strongly condemns the attack in Christchurch. Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims and their families. We stand in solidarity with the people of New Zealand and their government against this vicious act of hate. This statement is from Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the President of the United States, well known to be active on Twitter in the early hours of the morning, has yet to tweet or say anything about this.
So, you know, you heard Nadia say when Vlad asked about, you know, as a journalist moving forward, what sort of questions are you going to be asking? And the first thing she said was, how could this happen? He was very active on social media. And so I'm going to pivot to you about that. I mean, that is one of the things that we've talked about that, you know, you have said that law enforcement has sort of put in their toolbox, right? Scouring social media and scouring the internet. Now, the internet is a vast, vast place, and there are very many dark corners, but very quickly people were able to find this manifesto, if it's connected to him, and other postings where he was sort of showing off some of his hardware and talking about his philosophy. So what gives? What happened, Paul?
Right. Well, you know what, Anne-Marie, I found what Nadia had said to be entirely fascinating, and because she speaks to the next step being foreseeability, what they should have known and why they should have known it and when they should have known it. And that, of course, begs the question, how much should we be monitoring social media? Now, we know from a law enforcement perspective on a global scale. I can't say that New Zealand, I can't say that New Zealand does this particular practice as aggressively as the United States or some other countries. They may or they may not. I don't know for sure. But what I will say is that this speaks volumes about the need for us to preemptively identify information such as this, individuals that clearly are spewing hate like this and promoting violence. I'm not saying in any way that we should be, violating people's right to privacy, that we should be playing Big Brother. But what we should do and what we have to do, and this goes back to Nadia's point about what they're going to do right now, is we need to make sure that we embrace the degree of foreseeability. When things happen like this, when they're said like this, we need to have a mechanism globally that we report preemptively, because there is absolutely no question about it, Anne-Marie. This individual used a medium that he was hoping would get attention, but he also felt a degree of confidence. He also felt a degree of confidence that it wasn't going to stop him. And that's alarming.
True.
So, Paul, I guess, and we've been sort of chewing this over the last couple of hours. You heard, as Nadia said, and we just pointed out, that she wants to know, how did this happen? I guess as police begin to piece together, in fact, how this happened, what are you expecting to learn?
The behavioral side, Vlad. And what we'll learn is more about who he spoke to intimately, friends, neighbors, colleagues, whomever. We'll learn about where he worked. We'll learn about where he was educated. But we'll understand his inner loop. That's what we're going to move to at this point. Not just really today, but in the days and weeks to come, will be the behavioral forensic side of this investigation. And that will let us know where this actually began. Now, and again, I say this, Vlad, to make sure that our viewers understand, we are not saying that he wrote, that the shooter in custody wrote the manifesto. But I will say the author of the manifesto does speak to saying that he was influenced by events that took place in Europe. He mentions Paris, he mentions Stockholm, and he says, the author of the manifesto says, it was 2 years in the coming. So we have a lot to learn right now about the behavioral side of this individual, of this shooter, and really what set him off, what sparked him, and who's been educating him.
Yeah, that's a really good point. When you say 2 years in the making, right, then I wonder, well, what happened 2 years ago that sort of led him to want to develop a plan like this? So I know we only have sort of access to a limited amount of information. You, because you have friends in law enforcement, may know a little bit more than we do. But from what we know so far, 3 people are in custody. Do you think there are many people involved in this, or could he have pulled this off on his own?
Well, you know what, Anne-Marie, another poignant question. This reminds me a lot of when we covered the Pulse shooting. It also has some similarities to the Las Vegas shooting when it comes to collateral involvement. What we knew at that time and what we know now, and I think it's more than foreseeable what we're going to learn, is that there's collateral involvement in this. And I say that because of this. When we look at the vehicle or vehicles that were involved, we know that there was ordnance. There were explosives that were tied to that. Now, some of that possibly homemade, but clearly it's more than foreseeable that there was at least one person or more that assisted in accumulating the ordnance or the materials to comprise those ordnance or those ordinances. The other part is, when you look at 2 years, I think it's a relatively reasonable statement to make that there were people he spoke with, there were people he shared his views with, and as we do know from a behavioral side forensically, individuals like this like to talk about get-even plans. They like to tell people what they're going to do. So that's going to be the fascinating part here. Who knew, when they knew, and what they knew.
Paul Violas, always great to have your analysis, your expertise.
Thank you,
Sadly, it's often around tragic situations like the one we're discussing, but we appreciate it as always. Thank you.
Always a pleasure, Anne-Marie.